you identify that for me?
Yes, this is a copy of the report I provided on Monday morning.
Okay, that's reporting you did in this case?
Yes, sir.
And, Your Honor, I previously provided a copy to you and to the prosecution. I just moved it.
I actually have not seen it. You gave it to me. It's okay.
And I apologize.
Sorry. And if you did, it got caught up in some other papers. Thank you.
Dr. Maddox, as an initial matter, you heard the cross-examination of Mr. Osborne, and there was a brief discussion about Jesse's home. Have you ever been out to that home?
I have.
And did you ever see Jesse's room in that home?
I did.
And do you remember when that was vis-a-vis when this crime took place?
Yes, I went out there on February 4th, 2018. I went through the home, did a home inspection, interviewed Tiffany Osborne briefly, and then Mr. Campbell and I drove out to Townville Elementary School, and I also surveyed the crime scene there. It certainly wasn't a crime scene anymore, but certainly looked at the school.
How would you describe the room that was Jesse Osborne's bedroom?
Jesse's bedroom was downstairs. The house was a very nice house. Came up, there were dogs, very neat, well-kept house, very upper middle class. Downstairs, the basement, you go downstairs, there's a living area upstairs. I believe there's a living room, a kitchen area. You go downstairs, and what I recall, there were 2 bedrooms down there. Jesse's was on the left if you are facing the back of the house, and Ryan's old room was on the right. There were just basically 2 bedrooms down there to my recollection. Jesse's room was dark. There was not a lot of natural light down in that area. The bedroom across the hall, which would have been Ryan's room, was empty, and it was pretty isolated down there.
So comparing it to a dungeon is not necessarily an inaccurate comparison.
That wouldn't be my words, but it was certainly isolated from the rest of the house. It was dark and dreary. If you had a depression, that would not be the kind of room you would recommend a patient to be in.
Now, let's talk about your qualifications briefly. It's already been stipulated by the state that you're an expert in this matter. But talk about your qualifications as it relates to juveniles and the Department of Juvenile Justice and, frankly, the South Carolina Department of Corrections. Your experience and qualifications, I guess.
Sure. Your Honor, back in 1993 and 94, I did my forensic fellowship at the University of South Carolina in the Department of Mental Health. And as part of our fellowship year, the University of South Carolina had a contract with the Department of Juvenile Justice. So even in my fellowship year, our job was we ran a clinic out at the Department of Juvenile Justice, and every week I would go and actually treat juveniles who had been adjudicated delinquent and had a caseload over a year. After I finished my fellowship, I, of course, went on to work for mental health in USC, and so for 15 years after that, I continued working at the Department of Juvenile Justice. And eventually what happened, in the Department of Neuropsychiatry at the university, I was in charge of the forensic treatment program, and I actually ran the contract for the Department of Juvenile Justice for the university. So for over 15 years, I performed disposition evaluations for the family court judges. I worked at the detention center where Jesse would have been. I actually worked with Dr. Sharman, and we treated the juveniles there. I worked at Willow Lane, which is where the adjudicated juveniles go. I worked there and did a clinic for years. I covered every unit at the Department of Juvenile Justice if one of the other doctors that we had on contract were not there to work. During the course of that period of time, I performed, I would have been called to testify in some waiver evaluations, usually by the prosecution, because it would have been one of the juveniles I had some kind of interaction with, maybe during their treatment or having done an evaluation for family court. And then after I finally stopped doing the DJJ work, we had enough, we actually got child psychiatrists at the university. So once we had enough child psychiatrists, I quit treating the juveniles out there, but still oversaw the contract. And then after I finished the Department of Juvenile Justice work, I still did treatment and patient care, and I worked at the Department of Corrections. We took a contract with South Carolina Department of Corrections. At the time, they were getting sued by Protection and Advocacy, and I worked there for 4 years. I worked at the Gilliam Psychiatric Center and treated the acutely mentally ill. I worked over at the long-term care, the residential treatment unit, and saw patients there, and saw whatever patients they needed. I typically would go out there on Thursday mornings, but I also worked at the Department of Corrections under contract for a period of time.
Okay. And describe briefly your work with people that have been charged or convicted of killing someone, including death penalty cases, life without parole cases, and people that are already convicted.
That's been probably 70% of my career over the last 26, 27 years.
How many states do you actually work in? How many states have you done work in regarding that kind of work?
Arizona, Nevada, Texas, Oklahoma, Indiana, New York, excuse me, not New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama.
California?
Yes, California.
When did I retain you in this case?
Very soon after these charges, I believe probably within 10 days of Jesse being charged.
And describe for the court how many times you've met with Jesse.
I'll have to refer to my notes. I saw him on the first time was October the 10th, 2016, so about 12 days, 13 days after this happened. I've seen him 12 times, in addition to observing him during various court proceedings.
Describe his physical appearance when you first met him.
He was tall for his age. When I first met him, he was 14 years old in 3 weeks. He was about 14 years old 1 month by the time I saw him. He had not really reached full puberty yet. That was one of the concerns I had. He wasn't shaving. He didn't have a lot of facial hair, those sorts of things. He was, in my opinion, very immature in his presentation. One of the first things he asked me, when I met with him, he asked me, did this mean he couldn't go to Mars?
Well, let's just go ahead and talk about Mars a little bit, because Mars was a lot of our conversations with him as well for a good while.
Correct.
Talk about his discussions about Mars.
His goal at the time, he was very interested in space, and he wanted to be, his goals in life were to be an astronaut and be one of the first people to go to Mars. That changed over time, which it does with teenagers. A lot of young men are interested in space, especially if they like science or math. So his interest went from space and exploring Mars to colonizing the ocean. He decided after he couldn't be an astronaut that his plans were to start an undersea kind of business operation, one where he would explore but also make money, those sorts of things. So over the years, his interests have kind of changed, but he was very, very interested in Mars at the time I saw him.
That was one of the things he talked about all the time with you when you first started seeing him, isn't that correct? Sure,
because that was a topic that was easy for him to talk about. He had certainly committed a horrible crime. As I've learned over time, he certainly had some abuse issues. So that was just an easy topic for him to talk about. It wasn't emotionally loaded, and so he spent a lot of time talking about that.
Okay, so the first time you met him, I believe the prison records say he was about 6 feet and about 145.
That would seem right. He certainly was tall for his age, his weight seemed normal. He certainly wasn't thin or anything.
Describe the physical changes you've noticed during the time you've
Well, I saw him 2 times in 2016, and then I saw him again in 2017. And by the time I had seen him on June 2nd, 2017, he had grown significantly. And so I had asked you, I thought it was very important that we videotape him at some point, because I felt like as time went by, it was going to be easy for all of us to forget that he once was a child, and he was certainly smaller and had different cognitive development than he did, you know, as time went on. And so he's grown at least 5 inches. There was one period of time where he weighed over 200 pounds. He lost some weight at the detention center, kind of on purpose. He was playing basketball a lot, so before he got transferred to Anderson, he had dropped some weight, and his weight stayed about 185 to 190 pounds as far as I know.
Now, who else in the Osborne family have you talked to?
I've talked to his mother, Tiffany, 3 times. I've talked to his grandparents 2 occasions in informal interviews. I've talked to his sister, Mary Lee, twice. Mary Lee once by telephone and then once in interview. And then I've talked to Ryan twice by phone.
And is it fair to say that you're also very familiar with the reports of the other doctors in this case?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I need to add, I also talked with Jesse's aunt, Mitzi Richards, because she'd had a lot of contact with him. One of the other interests, in fact, his aunt Mitzi had told me, and Jesse shared with me later, is he also liked ant colonies, and he was into growing ants, and that was an interest he had prior to his charges.
And so you're familiar with all the doctors in the case?
Oh, yes, yes,
And you've looked at all the reports that we've been talking about for the last 3 days?
I have.
And are you familiar with all the information that was downloaded on his phone from February of 26, on his phone that was dated from February 2016 through September 28th, 2016?
I think most of it, I wasn't here in court, I think, during some of that presentation, and I know I saw Ms. Price had made some reference to some videos, so last night I asked specifically and got the videos downloaded from the ones of Jesse combing his hair, and I believe the one with the gun very close to the time that he killed Jeff.
And the rabbit.
Yes.
Did those videos change your opinions or reinforce anything about your opinions specifically?
Yes and no. They show how immature he is, how he's about to go do something very horrible and doesn't seem to have, and he's nonchalant about it. I was surprised about that. I know that about Jesse. It doesn't change any opinions, but to see it, it does have an effect on people. There's 2 parts of Jesse. There's the Jesse that was abused, and that has all those issues that we'll talk about, but there's also the part of him that planned on shooting a school. And so that view of him very shortly before, it's not totally a surprise to me. His grandmother, Patsy, when I interviewed her, she told me the day that when she went down to give him the hamburger to eat for lunch, that she noticed he was dressed up all nice. So I had some suspicion that he was already planning in some way. But no, it's still, it doesn't change any opinions, but it's sobering to watch.
Why is it important in a case to speak to the family members?
Well, it's some cases it's more important than others. Whenever there is abuse in a family, it becomes very important. This family is broken. They are broken from the top to the bottom. They were broken before this crime happened, and they are even worse now, if that's possible, just because the trauma they all have faced. And so by talking to the grandparents alone and the mother alone, you will not get the history of what was going on in this house. The grandparents and the mother do not get along. And that's to be expected. It's not anybody's fault. They've lost a son, they've lost a husband. There have been years of abuse in that home. And each one only sees the side of it that they've been exposed to. It's not anybody's fault, but it is incredibly broken. And so what happened is there's clues. There were some clues that things were going on. For example, when Tiffany was questioned by the police, they noticed, I think it was Investigator Finley, I don't know if I have the right name, but I believe it was Investigator Finley, noticed that she had blue marks under her eyes and blue marks around her mouth. And was astute enough, did a great job, was astute enough to ask her, have you been abused? And even at the time of the offense, as soon as Jeff was killed, they had Tiffany in a truck, and she was able to say that was the first time we know that any official, DSS didn't know about this, DJJ didn't know about this, but somebody even at the time of the offense was astute enough to pick up on it. And so that was kind of one of the icebergs that was broken. There had been a long history. Jeff and Tiffany there was domestic violence in that relationship. There's no question about it. And so it was revealed. The grandparents, they loved their son. They knew that he drank, but every time there was an altercation, if the grandparents would come and calm Jeff down, they would hear Jeff's side of it. So for example, when the episode Ryan talked about yesterday where he was on the bed and he was pinned down, the grandparents told me that their version of it was that Ryan had taken karate or some kind of jiu-jitsu training and was trying to assault Jeff. So when you have abused families, you have one event, and everybody has a different view of it. So it's important in these kinds of cases. I've done a lot of cases where they've been about trauma. You have to do a lot of investigation. And so for me, the most helpful people were the siblings. They had been there. Mary Lee is much older than Jesse. Ryan's older than Jesse, but they were all there. And so each of them had different experiences. So what I've done in this case is when I had an episode of abuse, I corroborated it, tried to make sure that there's more than one person that could give us details about it. And then I would go to Jesse. This is what I've been doing in the last few months, which is why it took so long to get the report. As the abuse came out, I would go and confront him to see what he knew or didn't know about it. And so it's very important in this case, because of the trauma that existed, that the siblings be included.
Did you in fact create a record of familial traumas that you relied on?
Actually, your paralegal did that, but I collaborated with her. She was with me during these interviews, and we made a timeline so that we could refer to it more easily.
Mr. Ed, do you have a copy for us?
Thank you.
Is this a document that you relied on or utilized in preparing your opinions?
Yes.
Your testimony today?
Yes.
Now, we've heard some cross-examination about why none of this was reported. I think we're all familiar with domestic